Again, thanks everyone for being here today. We're super excited to dive in here for the next hour and a half with Sarah Simon in Studio Life for a wonderful watercoloring class. I'm going to go ahead and let Christy and Brooke introduce Sarah and tee you all up a little bit more for what we're going to do for the next 90 minutes. But we're super excited to have you here. Thanks for taking some time from your evening to paint with us. As always, you can send questions in the chat. Sarah will, let you know throughout when's a good time to ask questions and such, but you're welcome to the room. You can unmute as needed and whatnot. I'll be here as well. So just call out if anything happens or need some help. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, you guys, and thank you, Anna. I'm Christy Brumbaugh with Studio Life, and I think you heard from Brooke, if any of you got to take the intuitive painting class with Lottie. I heard that was a lot of fun. Love her. And yeah, we are thrilled to be introducing you to Sarah Simon. She is a fantastic teacher. If this is your first time dabbling in watercolor, or if you haven't done it in a while, or at any point in your watercolor process, you're in for a treat. Sarah's going to be doing a bit of an abbreviated class today. If you want more, we do have another class coming up with her in April on the 24th that we highly, highly recommend. So if you finish today and you're like, ooh, I want more of that, please feel free to join us for that. And don't forget to use your Whole You promo code for any classes that you want to try with us. So I'm going to hand it over to Sarah and have a great time.
Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Anna. Hi, everyone. Did you guys get outside and enjoy the sunshine today? It's pretty. It's that promise of spring, and I'm really hoping it's not the false spring, right? That hail yesterday was pretty crazy too. So I am Sarah Simon. On Instagram is usually where I share most of my work, and my screen name is The Mint Gardener. I have been watercoloring for the better part of 10 to 15 years. I've been creating and painting my whole life. My mom and my grandmother were both painters, so it was kind of always at my fingertips, and it's really a gift to be able to kind of just leave art supplies out all over the house. And both of my little girls also enjoy just creating as well. So I live up in North Seattle. It looks like I'm in a solarium, but I promise it's my basement. It's nice and humid down here, so the plants really love all the moisture in the air. So it's been fun to have this as my Zoom background. Kind of feels like I'm somewhere tropical. But yeah, I'm a UW alumni myself. And when Christy and Brooke and Anna reached out, this was just such a treat to be able to teach you guys and to just share my passion of creating and of watercolor. So I'm going to lead you through just a few watercolor foundations. I really believe that watercolor can be accessible to anyone that gives it a try. I like to break things down A to Z, make it simple, but I also like to practice the foundations of watercolor as often as I teach them, because just like strong building blocks of a foundation, or the beautiful bricks that you dub, the whole picture is so much more beautiful when each element is designed well. So if you spend the time doing a watercolor wash and taking the time to really understand and watch that paint and water dance on paper, at the end of your whole project, you'll be so much more proud because all of those little pieces are in place. So like Christy said, if you are new to watercolor, we're going to cover the foundations. If you are returning and you're like, I've done this for 20 years, let's see if you can show me some stuff, I'm here for you too. So we're going to have fun. I'm really excited. So let me go through just a few of my favorite materials. This is usually how I like to start my class. My classes are usually smaller, and we talk about high friend cards, and I usually have people volunteer. So if anyone wants to say hello, I'm very informal, and share, that's welcome too. I'll keep my chat on, and Christy and Anna and them will let me know. But yeah, so what I'll do is I'll go through all of the materials that I'm going to kind of use today. And I know you guys are working off of kind of a materials list. So obviously our supplies may not be the same. So you're welcome to type questions in the chat and let me know if you have questions about what I'm using versus what you have. I'm happy to kind of dissolve any myths. And sometimes art terms can feel like a cool kids club, and it's hard to sometimes ask a question because you're like, what if I use the wrong term? Please don't worry about that with me. I was actually an economics major at the UW, so art is something that's in my blood, not necessarily my degree. So I've had to learn all the terms too. Okay. So one of the most essential tools that we probably all have is a paintbrush. So I suggested using a round paintbrush. My most common used round paintbrushes are a size 4 and a size 1. The only reason they're called a round is if you were to look just down at the bristles, where the metal, which is the ferrule, meets the bristles, it's actually in a round shape. So it holds the bristles in a round. And that's why they're called rounds. The 4 obviously has a bit more bristles than the 1, but I would invite you to take maybe a round 4 or a round 1 and to kind of, if it's a new one, you can remove that plastic point, the kind of the brush, the bristle protectors. Some people like to put it back on, and I would encourage you, if that makes you feel excited, go for it. I would encourage you to smooth out those bristles really well before you try to put it on, because those little wonky hairs going off can start painting on their own when you try to use it another time. So just keep that in mind. But your round 4, if you remove that cap, by just using the lightest amount of pressure against your hand, you can actually feel just the point of the bristles. All right. So that's a really light pressure. It's going to give you a really light stroke. And just like that, if you were to increase the pressure, you increase the bristles. The amount of pressure dictates what kind of mark you're going to be able to make with your brush. Okay. And while we have the brush in our hand, it's always nice to kind of cover how to hold it. So this is a classic hold. I'm a left-handy, so I'll just kind of like wonky here, but you can see I'm holding it pretty much like I would a pen. This is called the bulb of the brush. Right after the ferrule, there's usually a part in the brush that gets a little bit wider. That's a great spot to grab hold of the brush and grip it. If you want to do a little bit more detail work, you can scooch down. There's really no right way. And light pressure, sometimes if you scooch down and use just a light pressure on the bristles, you can get a finer point. That is how you hold your brush, and that's what you've got, round 4s. You probably have a jar of water, because when you watercolor, usually there is a good amount of water involved. I would invite you to definitely grab a jar of water if you don't have one. Paper towel, another great thing to grab that we're going to be using. I have a nice few pieces of paper. So I like, there's, back on the Cool Kids Club, you can kind of go, there are so many different types of paper, art paper in general, but then watercolor paper. Oh, and Brenna, that's a great question. She just sent me a message. I'm going to read it because there might be other of you that's what I love about questions, is if one person has them, some other people might have them too. I have watercolor brush markers, not a palette of paints. Not sure if those are workable. They absolutely are, Brenna. And I can kind of alter and let you know if anyone is working with watercolor brush markers. Absolutely doable. It is going to be a little bit of a different process, but you're going to be using the water to move the paint in a very similar way that you use the brush. So those are totally fine. It'll be fun to play and experiment. Good question. But yeah, so watercolor paper, I use a cold press, which is the most common type of watercolor paper that watercolorists use. And the reason is because if you were to take your hand onto the top of a watercolor paper surface, you feel a little bit of texture, and that is called tooth. Okay, so it's got tooth. Rough press watercolor paper is going to have more tooth, even more of a gritty texture. And then on the other side, there's hot press, and that's nice and smooth. Cold press is the best to use just because it gives you a little bit more drying time. All right. Ooh, fun. More questions. You guys are great. Jesse says, does it matter if we use transparent or opaque watercolors? I have both and I'm a complete newcomer. Great question. You can use both. Opaque watercolors are going to be more like acrylic in the way that you can't see through them. So transparent, that's actually a really great segue, Jesse. So thank you. Watercolor is known for its transparent nature. All right. So the idea is a watercolor wash is a transparent layer of color on paper. And the idea is to get it really nice and smooth so there aren't hard drying lines or streaking. Okay. So when you say an opaque watercolor, what is usually added is a chalky white. So I like to think of opaque watercolors kind of like Egyptian hieroglyphics or ancient Ice Age cave paintings that they've found all over the world. I was actually just reading this incredible art book talking about how painting is one of the oldest art mediums the world over. And they've found cave paintings all over the world, over 360 different locations all over the world, cave paintings. And obviously there wasn't one artist traveling around just really excited about cave painting. So they are finding that cave painting really was a global phenomenon and it was like Ice Age. So I think that's pretty cool. We may have Instagram as a global phenomenon now, but it used to be cave paintings. So back to opaque watercolors. The reason I brought that up is because they actually oftentimes, in order to have, if you just had a transparent layer of paint on a rock wall or on the pyramids, it would be a lot harder to see. So they would mix in a chalk or a white substance, like a white paint. So that increases its opacity. So the color gets a little bit more saturated. Okay. So if you think about it, I also like to explain it like putting cream in your coffee. You like to take your coffee straight, no sugar, no cream. That means you're probably just a purist watercolorist. But if you like to throw a little bit of cream in, that's that opacity. And that's almost like, it's technically called a gouache, but we can call it opaque watercolors and that's totally fine. So I use both and I often mix in white. Most watercolor kits come with a white so that you have the option of mixing in an opacity so that you can change the tone, tinting and toning colors. Okay. Already such fun questions. This is wonderful. Let me see. The last thing I want to cover actually, because you said paint, that was fabulous, is I have palettes with me. And these are dried watercolors. So this is the fancy palette. And it was actually made by a local artist here in Seattle, which is so fun. But because I really do want watercolor to be accessible and you don't need a fancy handmade ceramic palette or porcelain, you can use $1 plates from Goodwill for your palette. There's nothing fancy needed. The really nice thing about a dinner plate that I have found that I use all the time is it's really large mixing surface in the center. Okay, you can see that this is a well-loved palette. And this is one of my favorites. I've actually stopped painting on this one because I think it looks a bit like a work of art itself. And I don't know if I want to mess with it anymore. So the key is that you have a large mixing surface, okay? And this is one of the reasons I absolutely love watercolors. And when I do have in-person classes, I usually bring a collection of my plates and I set them in between a group. And oftentimes the collection of people create some incredible colors, maybe combinations of one color or another you wouldn't have thought of. And a conversation begins around color or mixing. And it's just a really cool common bonding place. But I also love it because oftentimes what happens is water, when you get one color wet, it starts to blend and move around your plate and it may interact with another one of the colors. And oftentimes interesting things happen on your palette if you're willing to kind of sit back and watch the dance. So it's really fun to be a part of as well. So we're going to play with that. But yeah, so I encourage you to use your plate palette, a regular palette. If you have a travel palette, I've actually had to buy my family a whole new set of dinner plates because the cool thing about watercolor is you can reuse and reanimate these plates as often as you'd like. Paint really goes a long way. It's one of the best conservation ways to paint is just using a plate palette. So I bought them new dinner plates and I've saved all of my mixes. So watercolor is one of those things that you can do for 10 minutes. When you get called away or you're back on a Zoom meeting, you can take a break, everything dries. And when you want to resume in 10 minutes or 10 years, the paint, the mixes, everything is preserved and saved so that you can reanimate again. All right. There may be a few cat hairs for the 10-year mark, but you can just brush those off. So that's totally great. Adrienne says, would a wood palette work? Okay, so that's an interesting, so I have tried a bunch of different surfaces. It depends on if the wood palette's sealed, it kind of depends on the surface. So if there's a nice sealant, yes. I've painted on ceramic that is also unsealed, and all it does is it just sucks all the color and the water in. So the key is any type of surface works as long as the water stays above and resists the surface. All right. So that's kind of key. Like this lovely surface that you see in my technique view where my hand is, it's a really nice white wood. It's I think it's like a pine, but it's not fully sealed. So I wouldn't want to paint off of it because a lot of the color and the water would probably absorb into it. So for mixing, yeah. So even for mixing, you could totally mix on any surface, but just realize if the palette isn't sealed, most likely the water and the paint will absorb in. However, I really love the idea that in art, there aren't that many right answers. There's a lot of gray. And in that gray, there's that discovery and that experimenting that can be really fun. So Adrienne, you may just be creating the next coolest type of watercolor palette right there. So I would encourage you to play and try it. All right. And let us know how it goes because I love that. So on these palettes, you see they're dried, little bits of paint. So if you have tube paint, that's what this is. It's just been squeezed out onto the surface and it's been allowed to dry. You can do it that way, or you can use your watercolor brush markers, or you can also use what they call cakes or pans. It's little dried bits of watercolor. Most people are familiar with those when you talk about when you learned, if you attended school in the K through 12, you played with them in kindergarten. They were the little primary circles, and that's a cake or a pan watercolor. Okay. So all of these different things can be used, and it's just how you interact with them. All right. So before we ever even bring our paintbrush to paper, I like to think about making our magic sauce on the palette, okay? But before we even do that, we want to make sure, I want you to know exactly what my brush is doing in the bottom of my jar, okay? So here is a mason jar that's empty, thankfully. We live in a quarter of an acre in North Seattle, and we have we inherited some incredibly beautiful golden raspberry bushes. So I discovered these are wonderful for raspberries. And then when you've eaten all your raspberry jam, you can paint from them. So this is what my brush is doing. It's a side to side motion. I'm never going straight down into the water. I'm doing just along its side of the bristles. All right. So oftentimes the bristles are toe to heel. So I'm just going ahead, and this is called animating your brushes. It's also called clearing your brush. So this isn't something you do once. It's something you do throughout the entire time you're painting. So if you ever see me reaching into my brush and into my jar and I'm not explaining exactly what I'm doing, that's what I'm doing at the bottom. And sometimes you really can't tell because it's straight down or the water's cloudy. So it's a side to side motion, clears the brush bristles, clears it of previous colors. It also tells the bristles, hey, we're ready for a new color, or we're ready to suck up some water and get painting. Okay, so you can go ahead and get your round 4 or your round 1. Now, if anyone has those watercolor brush markers, hang tight because I'm going to kind of explain this magic sauce, and that really pertains to the water and the paint mixture. And brush markers are just a slightly different, but I will definitely tell you how to play with those as well. It's just slightly different. Okay. All right. So I'm going to switch to my technique view. It's kind of like my primary view. So you can really see up close what I'm playing, how I'm holding my brush. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and get my bristles wet in my jar. All right. They go ahead and tell my brush bristles we're ready to engage. And then I'm going to select a color. I usually like to pick a color that's a little darker while I am teaching, just so that everyone can see what I'm doing really well. But I would encourage you to just pick whatever color is calling your name. I'm going to go ahead and just start bringing water. So I'm just going to take my water from my mason jar and start bringing water to this little dab of paint in the center of my palette. It's called Moon Glow by Daniel Smith. And if I throw any names out or anything, again, if you're like, I have to have that color, just let me know. You can always DM me on Instagram too, if you think about it later. I love talking about paint on Instagram. So what I'm doing, water to just my palette, and I'm running my brush bristles over that saturated bit of paint and creating kind of this lovely little puddle, all right, next to it. So in my books, I like to talk about, I like to use analogies because I feel like analogies help something that may feel a little unfamiliar or awkward become more recognizable and approachable when you use language that we're all familiar with. And analogies are exactly that. So, my analogy for creating this magic sauce on the palette is soy sauce with a touch of wasabi. So, if you are a sushi fan, you know that a saturated bit of wasabi is incredibly potent, right? You always know if you've had just a bit too much wasabi in your soy sauce mixture because your eyes cry and your ears pop. So what I'm doing is I'm creating that same kind of consistency. So if I pretend that this saturated bit of dried tube paint, or if you're working in a cake paint, is the bit of wasabi, I'm creating this nice soy sauce with a touch of wasabi. And this is the magic sauce that I'm working out of. Now, I know not everyone is a sushi fan, and some people prefer numbers. So I would say that this consistency is about 80% water and 20% paint. So that's the consistency we're looking for. So I'm going to pick this up too, so you can really see it travel. So we're looking for this magic sauce to have movement. All right. And then I'm not sure if you can see the shine. Yeah, there it is. There, you can see the shine. You can see how this paint is wet and shiny, and this is obviously dry and not animated. Okay. So this is the consistency that we want to bring to our paper. Okay. And when you create that correct consistency on your palette, really most of the work is already done for you. That's your first dance move as a painter. You get everything queued up and ready to play. All right,
So
if
we've
you're
got
oh
just
yeah.
a few questions.
Oh,
One
yay.
is if you're using the cake dishes, kind of like the hardened,
Yes.
how do you recommend getting that water consistency started? And then also, do you have any recommendation on just starting the puddle from scratch?
Yes. If you don't have the dried paint on there, do I just put some paint from the tube on there and then dilute it? Great questions. Okay, this is great. So sometimes I just get so into watching the movement shine. I appreciate that, Anna. So if let's do Danielle, your question first. If you have the kindergarten looking cake dishes, you're gonna treat your little cake just like this tube paint that's dried. Okay. But I know it's like in its own little container, like it's in its own little cupcake holder. So you're just going to pile water on top of it. All right. and just dab it so you're collecting raindrops on top until you kind of got this nice film of water on top of it. And you can either take that nice film, that consistency of that water and paint, and dab it onto a palette. You can kind of dump it on there, and then you'll be working with that same consistency. And you'll take your paintbrush to your water to the top of that cake, and then move it around. Maybe take that bit of your cake and then put it into your palette. And then you'll be able to work with that consistency. All right. And Danielle, tell me if you needed to see a little bit more, and I'm happy to do that again. Matria, sorry if I'm not saying your name correctly. How do you start the puddle if you don't have the dried paint on there already? That's a really good question. Do I just put some paint from the tube on and then dilute it? Correct. You are absolutely correct. So if you're just creating your palette for the first time, let me show you one that's not wet, so I can kind of hold it up. So if you have a plate or a palette that has a bit of a lip, I generally tend to suggest people kind of pour their tube paint up on the lip or just on the angle, because once you do that and you start introducing water, the water will pool in the lower part of the plate, but the preserved bit of really pigmented, saturated paint will stay up there. And then that'll just last longer, right? Because if you leave too much saturated paint in the middle of your mixing area, that's how you end up kind of with muddier paint quicker, and you have to clean your palette more. Where if you put your little paint dabs up here, then you have more mixing room in the middle. Also, if you're pouring fresh tube paint, that soy sauce and wasabi analogy goes even further. So because these dabs of paint are already dry, the saturation is, it's stilled, it's frozen, right? But if you're pouring fresh, wet tube paint, it's going to be incredibly more saturated. So I would say just using the very point of your brush to slowly hook into that wet tube paint and draw it down, and then mix into that little spot that's drawn down, rather than trying to throw water on that entire wet tube. You'll have a little bit more success, and you'll know that you're not using too much tube paint by just starting off small. Just think of it as like really potent wasabi, right? All right. Okay. Lorna says, hi, having difficulty seeing the palette overhead view. Can I switch the view? Is it possible to make the palette image horizontal and not vertical? Oh my gosh. Okay, Lorna, we have tried this so many times and it just will not, because I'm connecting in the overhead view from a phone. So that's my setup above. I don't have an ability to make it horizontal, but I can potentially bring my phone closer to the palette if you guys want to try that. So if you want to hang on tight, I will bring it closer. I just have to give myself enough room to move my brush. Otherwise I keep hitting the camera and then you guys all get motion sick. So maybe look at my face for a minute and don't look too closely at the technique view so that you don't.
Sorry to interrupt you, Sarah, but Anna, this might be where if you were to highlight just Sarah's technique feed, it will probably give people a better view. They can still hear her talking. There we go.
Yes.
All right.
Lauren, is that better? And good, Matria. I'm glad that was helpful. All right. Yeah, that's nice and close. Now I can really show you that movement and shine. All right. See that? We're all familiar in Seattle with that raindrop. Yay. Oh, good. You guys are all saying that's much better. Oh, I'm so glad. Good. Yeah, depending on what screen you're watching me on too, that probably helped a lot. Okay, so brush pens though, really quick. I want to talk briefly on that. So a brush pen, instead of a paintbrush, you already have all of the pigment as a part of your tool. So you're going to lead with your paint and follow with the water or your blending tool. It was Brenna. Do you have a blending brush marker with your watercolor brush markers as well, or do you just have the colors? So I can know, let me know when you have a minute. I know to like put things down, type, and then respond. But there's all sorts of ways to watercolor marker, but I think the best way is usually to use your marker that has the paint basically essentially in it, and then follow it with water. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys a nice wash. Okay, so a wash is a transparent layer of color, like we mentioned, that has movement and shine. And we want to transfer this really great consistency that's on our palette over to our paper. All right. Oh, good, Brenda, you answered. I have the watercolor brush set, then a brush that holds water in it, and another brush. Oh, you've got the whole set. You're so set. Okay. So, Brenda, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to lead with your marker and follow with the brush that holds the water. Okay, so the brush that holds the water is going to be your blending tool. All right, so just like you would use water to blend, like we're going to in watercolor here, we're also going to use your blending brush tool. And this is great. Again, it's a great experimentation of different tools and playing, and really playing in the mixture of it is just part of the excitement. Okay, so let me rearrange here to make sure I get enough space because I want to be high enough that you guys can see where my brush is doing. So as I teach normal classes, what I encourage people to do is watch the first time. I'm going to give you a visual as I also explain the auditory exactly what I'm doing. Then I will pause my teaching, my visual teaching, so that you can take your eyes off the screen and look down at your own papers to create and replicate what I've just done. Okay, so let's watch the first time. So this is to create a wash. So I go with my brush into my jar. I go to my chosen magic sauce, which is this incredible moon glow. I don't know if you guys, yeah, you can see a little bit. Do you see how this is blue and then this is purple? Felt like that was a perfect UW paint, but it separates and turns blue and purple, which is really fun. So water, magic sauce, and then it is a side to side motion. So I'm holding right at the bulb of the brush, side to side motion. And do you see how you can see bits of white paper coming up beneath your wash? That's your cue. That's your paint and your brush telling you, hey, you're out of water. You need some more magic sauce. All right. So I'm going from my water to my magic sauce again. So I'm repeating the first step and a side to side motion. All right. Now I have a good amount. I have the color I want to achieve. Okay. So I'm going to follow the next step with just water from my mason jar. You can see me reaching in, and water, here's where water moves and makes that move and shine. Okay. So I use water to basically invite my paint into the space I want it to move. I'm not on, a solid plane. So if you're feeling like you want to kind of move your paper around as you work your way around the square, if that feels a little better for your hand, I would invite you to do that. But what I'm doing and demonstrating is that I'm going to go one more bit of water. I want this whole wash to be wet at the same time. Okay, so this whole wash is going to be wet at the same time. And this is the consistency we're going for. We're all familiar with raindrops, right? So this is that lovely 80% water, 20% paint consistency that has switched now to my paper. And I know it's the right consistency because I can tip my paper all the way on the side and we get that nice raindrop. Okay. And it traveled all the way around my paper, which tells me this will dry in a very nice, even smooth square where there's no hard lines. And you do end up using a lot of water. Okay. So I would invite you now, you can go ahead and you can follow those steps. I'll say them again. I won't show them so that you don't feel like you're missing out. So it was your paintbrush to your water jar, grab some of that magic sauce, a side to side motion, look for that paper coming up beneath, and then go ahead. That's your cue to go back to your water, scoop up a little bit more magic sauce, and return to your paper. Get it to the color you want. You can return a third or a fourth time to really get a saturated color if that's what you'd like to achieve. But usually, depending on how big of a piece you're making, 1 to 2 trips to your water jar and the magic sauce will do it. And then the follow-up strokes would be water so that you can achieve that raindrop. And I'm seeing some of you picking up your paper and testing your water drop, which is so exciting. I'd also encourage you to give yourself grace because we're learning, and we all know that we learn a lot better when we believe that we can try again and that we're learning and we can have just a little bit of time to laugh at ourselves. So some people really struggle finding that water drop in the beginning. So don't worry if you do. We're going to practice a watercolor wash a lot. All right. So this is one of those key foundations in watercolor that whether if you're painting a pet portrait or an abstract group of squares or, a beautiful tropical sky, you actually are using this same technique as the watercolor wash. And the idea is everything is wet at the same time, so there's no hard drying lines. Okay. All right. Does anyone have any questions on that? Feel free to type them in. And Anna, let me know again if I miss any, but I want to show you guys another technique here. All right, I'm going to go ahead and animate. I use this as my brush holder. It's just a chunk of coral. I like collecting little things on the beach. Well, that's been a long time since I've done that, but I like to bring them back because it's a little piece of creativity and brings me back. But everyone's always like, what is that white chunk of thing you're using? So that's a coral. Sherry says, what size brush are you using? I am using a round 4. This is a 4 right there. And this is the Princeton Snap series. This brush is about $2 to $3. The one watercolor material that matters and that if you're wanting to really invest in this art form is paper. So I actually use all student grade brushes. They're all synthetic hairs and bristles, so it's not real hair. And I really like using these student grade brushes because they hold their point so well and I can use them a long time. Yeah, you're welcome, Sherry. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create another wash and we're going to play with the second technique, which is called wet in wet. Okay, so the first, remember, I'm going to show you how to do it and then I'm going to invite you guys to do it. So I'm first creating a wash. So I'm looking for my cue. There's my cue to pick up some more magic sauce. So water to magic sauce. It's a sky blue. And this is actually an opaque watercolor that I have my brush in right now. You can tell the opacity, it's a little creamier, right? It's not quite as see-through as that moon glow. All right. Now I am going to finish this wash off with a good dose of water from my jar. Right, side to side. Right, I usually use my other hand to kind of hold on to the paper because I'm not being particularly gentle with my brush. It's a bit of a scrubbing motion, almost like a broom on your paper. So the pressure is definitely medium pressure, but you don't have to be too delicate. This paper, if you have 140-pound weight watercolor paper, it can really take a lot of water. Okay, let's check for our raindrop. So that's always a nice cue. So I have found mine. Notice when I'm tipping my paper too, this wash has no raindrop. That first one in Moon Glow, it's already on its way to drying. Where this one says, hey, I have movement and shine. I am ready to play. So wet in wet is the technique where you're dropping wet paint into a wet boundary. So I like to think of watercolor. Let's see. I'm going to find a red. Reds or purples are always really incredible to drop in. Let's do this one. This is Paraline Violet here. So I'm going to engage this one, wet it, make my soy sauce with a touch of wasabi. All right. And now when I bring I go from my brush to my water to my magic sauce, And I'm going to, when I say I drop in, I do wet and wet, it really is just the lightest amount of pressure where I make contact with the wet boundary. And watching this paint move, when you lift your paintbrush, you see that that's the highest concentration of paint released from your brush. And if you want a little bit more paint, you can skip the mason jar drop and go right to the just the more concentrated bit of your paint dab. So in my books, I talk about how that is that's more like a heavy cream rather than soy sauce with a touch of wasabi. We've moved to about 50% water, 50% paint, and that's heavy cream. So if you're working again in a pan, instead of working from that puddle that you've created to the side with the more diluted paint and water, you're working with the more potent bit of, oh, sorry, my phone, I need to plug it in here. 1 second. All right, there we go. All right, and we're on. Okay, so you're working with more of a potent bit of paint. So the absorption and the, this is, the technical term is bleeding or veining, but I don't like that as much. And I like to call it fireworks because that's what I feel like it does. So just for demonstration's sake, we're going to see that one still has a little bit of wetness, which is really fun to play with. But do you notice how this is not moving as fast as that one? And this one just kind of exploded right out of the brush. So what you learn with watercolor is I say it's a dance because it really does have a lot to do with timing. If you wait for more water to be evaporated, the movement with that second bit of paint you're dropping in is not going to be quite as dramatic, but it will be very saturated and potent because it's just not moving quite as fast. Okay. So if you're not getting fireworks, don't panic. That's normal. What I would suggest is you wash down your entire wet boundary, your wash, and try it again. All right. Um, these little squares, these wet and wet squares, they're one of my most favorite relaxing things to do. I'm actually working on a book with an art therapist right now. And we came up with a bunch of different exercises because watercolor is really such a calming, mindful act. We all are very familiar with the term mindfulness and self-care, but there is something to having your brain, which is why you guys are all here, is having your brain focus on something that isn't as familiar to your normal everyday task. So with that focus comes the turning off of the monkey brain, as they say, and you're focused in on the craft and the process. And that's one of the beautiful things about art, is that it's escape from the everyday and a real break for your mind. This is a real gift. And you don't just have to drop in one color. I hope you guys are having fun doing this, enjoying the adding of colors. I mentioned at the beginning, I'm a mom of 2 daughters and we love creating together. And there are some days where, it's family movie night or some evenings, and I can only watch so many Frozen so many times before I go, I think I need a little recharge as well. So this is something that I do, and I've actually taught my husband to do, and we do together, is we just make beautiful squares on paper and watch the movement of paint, and it's incredibly relaxing. Now, depending on where you live or how much humidity is in your air, like I mentioned, in Seattle or in Hawaii or in an area that has the higher humidity and maybe you don't have a heater or air conditioning unit turned on, it is a lot easier to make these paints dance. If you have air conditioning on, or I've taught classes in August outdoors, and you really just have to pile that water on. So your trip to your mason jar of water, to your jar of water, may be more frequent, depending on the humidity in your air. So just be aware of that. Becky, were we supposed to have more than one color sauce ready? Ooh, good question. No, you weren't. But you can. You can drop the same color into the same color. So wet and wet can be the same. You can also even do this, Becky. I'm going to show you wet and wet, but this is just using a watercolor wash base. So you can't really see what I'm doing right now, right? Because believe it or not, that murky jar of water that in watercolors say if you wouldn't put your goldfish in it, you probably shouldn't be painting from it. So we would not put little Stanley in that jar, but I still can paint from it because there's not that much of a tinge. So if you don't have more than one color ready, you can create just a clear wash water and then drop in using that wet and wet technique, another color or your only color and see what happens there, which is really beautiful as well. And you can do a side to side motion, see what that does. And then you can also just do little dots, which is always calming and fun. And another thing you can do with wet and wet, which I really love, especially as your wash is moving near to drying. So I'll show you that on the moon glow. So this is a wet and wet technique. This is all wet and wet. Okay. These are all different ways to add color or interest to your watercolor surfaces. It's just adding a dot of water. So I'm dropping in pure wash water into a nice wash that's already on its way to dry. And you can start to see if you're doing it yourself or if you look really closely at this wash, it almost looks like little snowflakes are starting to appear in your wash. And that's pretty awesome. And depending on when you drop in those little raindrops or more paint, it'll they'll be different every time. And that's kind of part of the fun. I'll show you two examples from a recent class. So this is a great example. So the base was this pale rose blush. The base wash was actually this color. And we added drops of alizarin crimson and yellow ochre. Now, check out the difference in this. So let me see if I can get both of these on the screen. So the one at the top of the screen, do you see all those kind of like craggy little lines? It's a little bit sharper edged. It almost looks like they're called watercolor blossoms or blooms. So that was already on its way to dry. And so it dried with more defined lines. We interrupted the process a little late, is what I'm saying. This is a much more smooth wet and wet. You see this high to low contrast and this blending of colors, and it's really a beautiful sunset. That's a much smoother look. Now, both are beautiful, but for different reasons. So as you play and experiment, especially with just these foundational tools that you're using that happen to be incredibly relaxing at the same time, you learn timing and you learn different paints and different seasons and when something happens. It's a bit of a chemistry science experiment as you go. Brenna says, I'm not sure if it's due to the concentration of paint in the watercolor markers, but I'm not getting the discrete lines with the wash on wash technique. It's more like bands of color. Yes, Brenna. So when you're using markers, it is much, 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 much harder to get a smooth wash. What I would suggest is, so you have bands of colors. So you have this, you've got a band of color, and then you're trying to blend it with water, and then you have another band of color, right? So what I would do if I were you, those bands of color, the ends end up being really hard to blend together. So I would take a third color or even more water, but usually another color is what really gets the watercolor markers together. And a side to side motion, it's almost like you're side scrubbing those lines and back and forth. And what it does is it blends the two together with the third. Okay. So it's kind of what you have to do. Watercolor markers can be a little bit more frustrating to work with. It's less of a dance and more of a precision. So in watercolor, often the beauty is a bit unexpected, where in acrylics and oils or markers and pens, the mark you make when you make it is exactly where you put your tool. Where in watercolor, we found I made marks up here, but the color is here. And that's where the unexpected beauty, it freaks some people out with watercolor. However, it also, when you learn how things work together, it can become a really beautiful way to play. Yeah. Brenda says, okay, I'll try that. I was trying one color on top of another wet square, but I'll try that technique. Yeah, try to blend the bands together. That might be a little bit easier than trying to do a large square. When you're using paint and water, that blending together, it's more important that you have a larger boundary where you don't necessarily need that with the markers. Shayna says, which brand of paper are you using? I am using Han Mule, and do not worry, don't try to scramble and write that down. It's the most beautiful paper I've ever used. And you're going to get an email after our class with the contact information to email my contact at Han Mule. Her name's Carol. She's wonderful. Her name's Carol Boss, and I call her my boss. She's sending everyone that emails her a free sample of watercolor paper. So you guys can play with this. She'll send you all the information. It's by far the most beautiful paper I've ever played on. So if you want to play more with watercolor, she's going to set you up and you'll get all that information from Christy and Brooke and Anna. Yeah, it's so generous. They're an incredible company. It's handmade paper from Germany. And they call and they make office jokes with Michael about Michael Scott pretty much the whole call. It's fabulous. They're a great company. Pam, you say, I can't quite seem to get the basic square down. That's no problem. We're going to keep practicing squares and rectangles, and I would encourage you to continue to practice. But can I ask you a clarifying question? Are you having trouble getting the actual square, or are you having trouble with the movement in the square? Because I'm not necessarily worried about you being able to paint a smooth square, especially it depends on the paper you have, the paint, the brush, everything. Plus just, I paint all day. I spend a lot of time making squares. So I'm not so worried about you making a perfect square. I'm more hoping that you can make that movement within the square. So let me know, Pam. Jesse says, I'm beginning to understand the folly of trying to do this on an easel. That's wonderful. So now you know why I have a phone shooting down straight onto my palette. Yes, watercolor on an easel is a challenge and everything is a race to the bottom, isn't it? Your palette, your paper is going to be lovely though. It'll just be very highly pigmented at the bottom. Yes. Adrian says, can you do other shapes? Absolutely. That's what I'm going to do next. I want to show you one quick thing that you can do with a paper towel. All right. Pam says, it's more the consistency and the flow, the balance of paint to water and sauce. Okay, sweet. So Pam, my first recommendation is to add more water. So I've taught enough classes in person that usually when people cannot get that flow, you need to put more water in. It feels very uncomfortable to put water on paper and it feels a little awkward, but I just try to do a little bit more water. And if you have access to a smaller brush, sometimes using a smaller brush makes you feel a little bit more confident. You can make smaller shapes, which is what we'll do right now. Okay, so I'm still using my round 4, but if you have a smaller brush, you feel free to use it. And I'm going to dip into this incredible blue indigo that has actually started to kind of make friends with this Paraline violet. So we're going to find out what kind of color this is. And notice I'm going to make a wash, but I did not visit my mason jar first. I went right to my magic sauce. And that is because I want to make a smaller shape. Okay, so just a side to side motion. I'm going to go ahead, maybe use the edges of my brush to smooth it. I'm kind of testing to see if I have a raindrop. I have a little bit, but I think I'm going to go ahead and go to my mason jar and add a little bit of water. But you don't want to add so much that you flood it where, oh shoot, if you do, this is what I wanted to show you. So this is what I like to call the biodome. So if you were to take up your piece of paper and test that raindrop, it would fly right outside the boundary. It would not stay in that nice square shape. Okay, so if you have that, I like to tear off a little bit of a paper towel and use the serrated edge. And just by making contact with the wet surface, Do you see how it just absorbs? Now it doesn't take, because I'm not pressing necessarily, I'm just dipping. It doesn't stop the movement, okay? So the paint in the water is still dancing on the surface of the paper, but it does absorb some of that excess water so that you can kind of see what you're working with. All right. So Adrian, this is your nice smaller shape. So you can see that we've gone from a larger boundary to a smaller boundary. Okay. And that's how you blot with the edge of a paper towel. That's what I like to call the vacuum. Now there's also a more severe type of vacuuming, which is kind of more of a dabbing. So I'm just taking a wad of paper towel, kind of making like a little pad, and I'm just going to dab into the actual wet boundary. So this is where I'm actually arresting movement. All right. I'm stopping movement here. And what's going to happen is it's going to dry and you're going to get some hard lines. All right. So you're going to get this hard line. And that in watercolor can be really beautiful if you're wanting to paint maybe the texture of a leaf or maybe some bark. Be really pretty, right? Those are really good little tips to know. All right. So those are blotting. So these are all different ways that you can play and add color. And this is a great way to remove color. And there's other ways to remove color too, but I want to show you guys some really fun movements with your brush. So, Pam, I try the smaller square. So switch to that dark blue, this little example right here, and try to see if you can get that raindrop in a smaller boundary to see if that helps you. Oftentimes, if you're working on student grade paper, like you'll find the Han mule when it arrives at your doorstep, you will never want to use anything different because it gives you more time. Or when you're working with the student grade paper, it often has a wood pulp in it instead of just purely cotton. And so it absorbs, the water evaporates quicker. So it's a little bit more frustrating. And if we could switch to my face, I want to demonstrate one of the brush strokes. And Christy and Brooke have told me that it's the best when you can see. Okay, thank you so much. You're quick. Okay, so this is the shape that we're going to play with making. Okay, so this is a leaf shape. I like to call it the point pressure point. You can make small little ones with your round one. See all those tiny little leaves. Or you can make big ones. So if you have like a round 6 or a round 10, you can make petals in this shape as well. Okay, so it's a leaf shape, but it's also a petal shape. And what it is, it's really back to that playing that we did right at the beginning when I was talking about a round brush. So with just the lightest amount of pressure, you can feel just the smallest mark that you'd be making. And then by increasing the pressure on your handle, it presses the bristles down far, almost to the point where you're scraping the metal ferrule along the paper. That's the drasticness of the stroke. So you're going from the lightest pressure to increasing your pressure and then the lightest pressure. And you're doing that the same time you're pulling down. So it's a compound stroke. So instead of doing this side to side, like we've been playing, now we're going to bring our brushes down. Now, I feel more comfortable pulling down. I've heard some people actually really prefer to do this stroke up. So keep that in mind, be willing to play with it. But I'm going to kind of demonstrate with my fingers what my bristles are doing. Okay, so if you guys are my paper and my fingers are the bristles, I have got the, my brush bristles have all of the paint. They have their magic sauce in it. I'm going to make contact with my paper. I'm going to start to pull down and make that really light stroke. Then I'm going to increase my pressure, which increases the width of my bristles. I'm still pulling down, decrease my pressure. I'm still pulling down. So at that end, I've decreased my pressure, but I've made this leaf that the top is light pressure, widened in the leaf, and then gone lighter. So it's point, pressure, point. And I find when I say that enough in my head, it starts to kind of be familiar. Okay, we'll switch back to my hand, and I want to paint a few of these because I want you guys to really see these shapes, okay? So we're going to remember this animation on our palette is definitely, it's not just a one time we're checking. but it's an all the time thing. Okay. So if you're doing this with your watercolor brush pens, depending on what type you have and the point, you might be able to pull this off. So I'd be interested to hear what you find. Little tiny hairs, better to get them before they hit your paper. Okay, so I'm gonna go with the stroke, and I don't move that fast. Point, pressure, point. Okay, and then point, pressure, point. I like it when a little bit of the paper shows through. You can do, I'm going to show you one more point, pressure, point, and then point, pressure, point. It's kind of a fancy little trick, and you've made a leaf with a nice reserved white center. I want to point out how I'm holding my brush. I'm just going to show you really quick. So do you see that the handle is headed back? A lot of people are tempted to do this with their brush during this stroke. And oftentimes those people end up with little slugs, and they don't know why they have slugs, but that's why. So it's how you're holding your brush. So I'm going to do a point, pressure, point, going up this time. Okay, so this is the other way you can do point, pressure, point. All right, that one got a little wonky, but you could attach it to a nice branch. All right, and we'll just continue point, pressure, point. And if you're struggling at all with this stroke, I'd like to welcome you to the club because it is not an easy stroke. I remember my first wreath commission took me days, and I overthought every leaf and probably overworked my piece, but I learned a lot. But this is really one of those. Now I'm switching to my round one. So this is one of those strokes where if you can perfect it in a round one, you can do it in any shape, any type of brush, whether you're like a round 12, even different shapes, but we'll just play with the rounds tonight. But this is, so I'm using my other techniques. So I've got my little point, pressure, point leaves, and we've gone from a large square boundary to a small square boundary. And now our boundary is leaf shaped. Okay. So those same techniques still apply, but if you think of them in the same way we learned watercolor, all of a sudden coloring in a leaf isn't quite so scary because we know that these boundaries are all wet. This boundary is definitely dry. All right, so we'll try to, there's no wet and wet happening there, but you can make a really nice little leaf shape down the center. Okay. If anyone's making slugs, I'd encourage you to switch to a smaller brush. And then what's happening probably is you're spending a lot of time doing the same pressure. So you need to spend a little bit more time at the top using that light pressure and then increasing your pressure, decreasing your pressure right at the end. So I'll do a few more. I'm seeing lots of fun little questions pop up. Let me just do one more leaf here, and then I will address your questions. All right. Okay, Becky, how do I keep a consistent color throughout the stroke? Mine is going dark, saturated to light, then back to dark again. Interesting. I don't do it as much going up. Ooh, that's fun. So it sounds like, Becky, you're most likely working on a student grade paper. I want to see, I think I've got some examples of that previous class. Yes. So I'll put this under my technique view. And what you can see is, see how some of these leaves have kind of more of a saturation? I have whole pages of leaves where I was trying to figure out why the heck my leaves were dark, light, dark, light, dark. And what's happening is in those lighter spots in your leaves, it's just a less consistency. There's less water and paint. So they're drying faster. And what it does is it's a resting movement. So you're stopping the movement so that wet paint can't move into that dried spot. And that's why paper makes such a big difference with watercolor. Okay. So you can kind of see this one I painted over, but you can see how it was dark, 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 and then some light stripes. A lot of it has to do with the paper, but it sounds like maybe if you're moving in that upstroke, you're maybe not taking as long. Maybe you feel more comfortable in the upstroke. So you're kind of making this upstroke motion faster, whereas you're pulling down, it's taking a little bit more work. So it sounds like you just might be more comfortable in the upstroke. Patricia says, I don't know what you mean by slug. Ooh, I'll paint one. So I remember teaching a class. This was in the before times, and I did a wreath class. And this girl, let me paint one. So she's like, why am I getting all of these marks that look like this? That one's here. Let's get a more saturated one. Why are all my marks like this? And so what was happening was, is she wasn't spending enough time doing the point, pressure, point. All right. So she ended up, which is one of my favorite stories, she ended up just adding little antenna to all of her half leaves, which she turned it into a slug wreath. And it was one of my favorite wreaths ever. And later she messaged me on Instagram. She goes, I practiced more and I finally am getting leaves. But what had happened is she just wasn't spending enough time in the light amount of strokes, so that light pressure, and more, she wasn't balancing out between light and heavy pressure. All right. Oh, good. Got it now. Good. All right. So that is your point, pressure, point, leaf. I know that a lot of these classes, it's really important to talk about kind of like our creative process and kind of, what has we've found has worked for us. And it's always fun to share as artists what works, and you hope that something will click. But something that I really have loved over the years as my art practice has changed is morphing my space into something that I can use no matter what life phase I'm in. So these leaves have really morphed with me. I remember most of my time painting in the early days were at my great grandmother's writing desk. So just right in the thick of things. I was working for a very large tech firm in the Pacific Northwest, which will remain nameless. And I just didn't have any time to myself. And what I learned is if I always kept a creative station, I called it my creative station, if I always kept it set up, I could pass by it and feel almost invited. Like, okay, my water's there, my plate's there, all of my paint's there. And I would almost paint in my mind until I could pick up my brush that was just sitting there waiting for me. And I think that the mental game I was able to play with myself, that I knew I could sit down for a few minutes and paint because everything was ready for me. And I didn't have the excuse of, oh, it's too much to pull out. Oh, it's too much to clean. I knew it was there waiting. And so that's been something that I share in my classes that I know a lot of people resonate with. And when my life got a bit more mobile and I was chasing my kids around, I ended up actually getting an IKEA cart, and kind of just putting them in all my favorite supplies. And I would take my IKEA cart wherever I needed to be. I would paint in a sleeping baby's room. I would paint outside while everyone played. And I just learned to adapt. And by dragging my little rolly cart around the house with me, I could easily put it in the closet too when I needed it to be cleaned up. But it was really nice just having all of my materials in one place. So creating a space that invites you into your craft so that that obstacle can be removed is one of my favorite tips. And another one is keeping it simple. It's just this ability to go, I'm going to create. I have 10 minutes this morning while I drink my coffee, and I'm just going to watch paint move, and I'm going to paint leaves. And 10 minutes often turns into 20. I actually get messages from people that have taken my classes all the time where there's pictures of them, selfies where they're in their Zoom meeting, but they've got their painting supplies just below it so that they're painting as they're listening. And it just feels very relaxing and very mindful. So just kind of an attitude of feeling like I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to practice leaves, or I'm going to make a beautiful slug wreath and be okay with that. Or I'm just going to watch paint move. It's really a nice feeling. I want to show you guys a wreath so that you can take these leaves really to the next level, and how approachable it can be. Don't feel any pressure. If you're really enjoying watching paint move in the wet and wet, you can just watch the wreath. Or if you're feeling like I'm ready to move on, I want to provide you with a project. These wreaths are great. So I grabbed a few things that I use regularly, and they all do have something in common, and it is that I trace the outside. So one of my friends is this amazing potter, and she makes these really cool vases. I love the faces, but what I end up doing is I just turn something upside down, and then I find my pencil, or, I use a roll of tape as a round, depending on how big I want it, or a ball of twine. I put it on a paper. I grab a pencil. If this is just a regular HB pencil, what I've learned over the years is a regular pencil doesn't actually erase very well beneath watercolor unless you trace very lightly. So I've learned to trace lightly, but I've also learned to use colored pencils. And colored pencils are actually great because if they're meant to be used with watercolor, the line that you may draw with the colored pencil dissolves in the watercolor paint, and they work really well together. So your piece at the end is very seamless. So I just trace kind of a round shape to give me a guideline. It can be an upside down cereal bowl or whatever you have. And I would encourage you to make fun shapes. So I'll start with a few leaves that I just showed you, but then I want to show you all a few other kind of fun marks. And wreaths can really take on whatever personality you want. You can have them very symmetrical, very rhythmic, or they can be kind of wild and free flowing. The more time you spend looking at an olive branch, you go, wow, I kind of want to be able to paint an olive branch. So it's fun. I actually, when my book came out last year, I had a gentleman, a family friend, buy it for his wife, who they're in their 70s, and they love to RV and tour around as they're both retired. And she thought he was so silly buying her a painting book because never in her life had she ever picked up a brush. One day she was sitting in the RV and my brush was there and the little painting kit I'd given her, and she picked it up, and before she knew it, she'd worked through my book, and now she's painting these incredible landscapes, because her passion is, seeing and doing beautiful things around the country. And she's just spectacular at painting snow. She's just become so incredible. And it was such a compliment. She messaged me and she said, I don't even look at nature the same way. I see a new dimension now. I see color differently. I see color as something that maybe I can mix on my palette, or I see shadow and light and shape differently. And she goes, it's just been such an incredible discovery. She's like, it's like a second life, which is just so exciting to hear. So painting can really become what you want it to be. It can be a fun mindfulness thing, can be a relaxation, an expression of how you're feeling. My 5-year-old paints her feelings very often. And then it can also become something that becomes just a peaceful pastime and hobby, which I just love. So what I'm doing, I'm just painting leaves. I'm just doing my point, pressure point. I like to sporadically move around my wreath. You might want to be a little bit more rhythmic. I'm mixing up my colors. Check and make sure no one's got. Anna says, yes, absolutely. We can go till 7:30. I'd be happy to. I can go all night. Usually everyone has to shut me off. So yeah. Adrian says, what's the potter's name? Oh, I'd be happy to share it. So her name is Cameron. She makes plates and dishes for some of the coolest restaurants in New York and Canlis in Seattle. Her I'm going to type it in the chat. It's Bow Rush. Let me make sure it's to everyone. How do I make it to everyone? There's so many fun people here. There, right at the top. Okay, so it's Bow Rush. So there you go. Thank you, Anna. But yeah, that's who makes this beautiful. So this was actually, she has second sales all the time. And I think his nose got a little bit smudged. And I was like, oh, he's mine. That one's got my name on it. She's like, okay. So she's wonderful. But yeah, we're actually trying to work together. We're going to figure out a way to make a really cool palette together, a painter's palette. And then she also wants to do some fun kind of like where I paint maybe with some glazes, and we can do some, just hand painted plates would be really fun too. So here is that point, pressure point. And then I'm just going to echo some of these leaves with that point, pressure point. Okay. And now I want to switch to my round one because I really do want to show you guys a few different strokes. So what I'm doing right here, I realize you can't see that when I pull it. So I'm doing that scrubbing motion, and that really cleans my round four. So I'm saying, okay, round four, hang tight. I'm going to go to my round one right now, but that's a really good way to clear your brush. And if you happen to forget to clean it later, at least you got some of the paint out. So when you pick it up again, it'll be a little easier to clean. I never use any sharp astringents or anything on my bristles. I usually just use water. And if they aren't clearing very well, so if I do that against the bottom of my mason jar, and then I do a side to side on my paper towel and it doesn't come off clean, then I'll run it under the faucet. But if not, I just do this, and then I consider that clean and ready for the next use. Adrian, you said, I know a potter and her name is Catherine or Katrine. Ooh, well, you'll have to introduce her to me, Adrian. Feel free to send her or send me her Instagram. Feel free to introduce us. I love meeting potters. I feel like this is made by a gal named, her Instagram is Pottery by Eleni, and her name's Helena. And she's really cool. She told me she prices all of her pieces. I noticed she ended in 7s or 5s or 3s. And she said it's because of her Greek lineage that she grew up with the idea that when you come to a table or you come to a place, it's not good to divide things equally. It's always good to share. So when you use an odd number, you are always forced to share with your neighbor, which I love. All right, so I'm using that point pressure point technique to just make smaller leaves that access, or they accentuate the larger leaves. There we go. I'm just kind of working my way around. It's always very interesting after posting a wreath like this on Instagram. I think people think hyperlapse time. We're all tempted to think that hyperlapse time might be real, but you can see how slow of a process it is and how relaxing it can be. All right, throw a few more leaves in there. Just saw a question pop up. Oh, you took pottery classes. How fun. I have taken pottery classes before, and turns out throwing, like any other art form, is much harder than it looks. What did you think, Adrian? Did you feel like it was approachable? Would you do it again, or was it hard? What do you think, watercolor or pottery? Which one's harder? I obviously found pottery a little bit harder. All right, so there's some leaf shapes. I also, like I said, I want to show you some different shapes. These are some of the ones that I was just teaching Christine Brooke when we just on Saturday when we had our last whale class, and then we're going to have another one like they mentioned in April. These are some of the different shapes, and it's always amazing how many shapes you can make with just one brush, right? Oh, that's awesome. Christine just mentioned, I threw for the first time during COVID, and Ghost the movie makes it look so easy. My stuff was short and squatty, laugh out loud, but I love my creations. Yes, 100%. I love Ghost. And absolutely, there is something about a delicate, like this delicate piece of pottery. It's incredible. Yeah, my pieces were all pretty short and squat and way more lumpy than I had intended, but I was very proud of them too. And I think I still have some around. I put erasers or shells in them. All right, so here's my leaves. I'll get lost in leaves any day, but I want to show you a few more motions. So, okay, I'm going to clear my brush. I'm going to go to my palette, make sure I have some movement and shine. I've got my 80% water, 20% paint. And you'll notice that when you're working with a smaller brush, like I'd mentioned, you're almost working with a higher consistency of paint to water. So if you're working with that pan or cake paint, you're working probably right on top of the cake. You're working on that wet section on top of the paint. If you're working with that fresh out of the tube, you've probably pulled a little section away and you're trying to kind of water that down. But the consistency is much more like heavy cream. Okay. All right, Jesse says, my first time at pottery class, my bowl was super thick and durable, and it became the cat's water dish. That's perfect. Yes, that is, mine totally looked like a pet dish. That's brilliant. Yes, I should give it to our cat. It was Frodo. He moved out with our renter, with his owner, and I miss Frodo. I actually had gotten him a leash to take him on walks because he wanted to come outside so bad with us, and then he was gone. It was pretty funny. Okay, so I'm going to show you this motion, this type of motion. But first, I'm just going to use, so see that really thin line I was just able to draw? That is that 50% water, 50% paint. Okay, so that's that really thin branch. Notice with my wreath, I didn't draw the line with my paintbrush. I waited because in some ways you may want to droop a leaf over and then your hard line of the vine becomes interrupted and it doesn't look quite as natural, right? So if you ever observe nature, it's never perfect. Things interrupt each other all the time, overlap. It's kind of, actually kind of awkward. So sometimes your most awkward leaf or your most awkward overlapping leaf ends up being the most natural looking. But to make these thin lines, again, we're about 50% water, 50% paint. And then I'm going to do this motion. So I've got a round one. Bristles are full of the magic sauce. I'm just going to grab that extra water droplet. If you've got one hanging out, you might want to remove it because what happens is it just floods your boundary. So I'm going to go from the point of my brush with point to heel, right? Point to heel, point to heel, and the heel is all the way touching you're touching the metal. All right, see, my paper is trying to tell me, hey, you're running out. So I'm gonna grab a little bit more. All right, and I am just letting the entire set of the bristles make the mark. Okay, so point to heel, point to heel. Go ahead and do more. I'm kind of moving my body. You can move your body or you can move your paper. I'm a little bit limited on what I can do with my paper right now so that you guys still have a good view. But this, just remember, you can move your paper. And you can point to heel. Your point can be on the top of the vine. And that's kind of a fun, different little mark. Okay. Sharina says, my Nana is a potter. She made me a ceramic paint mixing palette. Oh, that's so nice. That is such a gift and such a treasure. Oh, I hope you're getting to use it. Shayna said that. Sorry, the lights shine in my eyeballs. Shayna, that's awesome. And thanks, Anna. Yeah, that's awesome. She's saying that you guys get a little discount code for taking my classes at Studio Life. That's fun. I didn't know that. Hope to see you guys. If you guys do come, make sure you say hi and be like, hey, I was in your Discover You class. And Christine says, that's awesome. I was so excited. I already took the calligraphy class. Oh, you took it with Ellen. Letters by Ellen. She's a dear friend. She is a fun friend. She's actually the reason I got into painting. She convinced me that I had, into teaching. She convinced me that I had to teach, which was really sweet of her. And it kind of ignited an entire passion. She's wonderful. And Joe says, thank you, gotta go. I have fun. Thanks for coming, Joe. I'm glad you had so much fun. All right, I'll just keep painting some leaves. I'll show you guys a few more fun leaves to paint. My favorite part of class usually at this point is when people feel confident with a wash or with that wet and wet technique that we got to play with a few times, and you get to continue to play with as you change the size of your boundary and the shapes that you're making. My favorite part is always when I just look up and I just see scalps. That's always like that's my cue. It's absolutely silent. And I've learned that that silence and the head down just means everyone is having such a wonderful time. It's just a relaxing time. Yes, Patricia says, can you show how you did those fat flower petals? Heck yes, I can. So flower petals are very similar to this leaf shape. I'm going to go ahead. I'll switch to those because those are real fun. Let me show you just so everyone can see what you're referencing. And you can tell me if, Patricia, if I'm showing the wrong one, but I think I know what you were talking about. That is the piece I just did a few days ago. And it might be for a collaboration coming up I'm real excited about. But it felt like spring, and it's actually the palette we've been painting with. This is the palette that I built. So I think the cool part about watercolor is it always tells the tale of the painter. Thank you so much, Patricia. She said so pretty. You can, once you start understanding the foundations, like we just covered, you can start to see them repeated and you go, oh, I know exactly what she did there. So I'll decipher it for you. And as you start to maybe play with watercolor more, you'll be able to see it for yourself. So these petals were all done in a wash. I'll show you another one I just did. And I'm excited because it's very related to UW, but I did cherry blossoms. So in many ways, this is a little easier to decipher because it's closer to what we did, okay? So you can actually see all the stages of the flowers, both types of flowers, but you can see it a little bit better here. So you can see these are all washes, light watercolor washes, all right? And do you see where these petals blend together? That was one wash boundary interacting with another wash boundary. Same in here. You can see that high to low contrast. You can see in here it's really light, where in here it's more concentrated. So what did I do in here? I used wet and wet, and I dabbed in a little bit more of that pink, and I left this, just the white of the clear water from the jar, all right? And I let that entire wash dry, okay? Then I came back, and that's how you get these heavy, these harder defined lines or these darker stamens. I'm actually posting about this on my Instagram tonight. Got it all queued up for after our call. Here's another example. So you can see those basic washes, and then the dabbing in of more concentrated color. You can see right here, I'm wondering if it's going to be clear enough. Right here, do you see all that little like veining, the bleeding? That was dabbing white, that pure, that opaque watercolor. So it would be dabbing white into the pink. I didn't know what happened, and it turned out so fun. And then once this was dry, I came back and did the more details. And these details I did with a round one, same with these details. And you can tell the consistency of paint to water has changed. And that's why I emphasize the magic sauce so much, is because the work is done on the palette. The consistency of the paint and water is done on the palette, and then it transfers to the paper. And if you do the work on the palette and get it onto the paper, it's a much smoother, easier process, okay? Joy says, the color palette on those cherry blossoms are gorgeous. Thank you so much. That was a request because, you know, if you're not hanging out at UW or you're not in the area, but you really want to experience the cherry blossoms, it was a chance to bring the cherry blossoms to people. And cherry blossoms come in all of those amazing, like lighter shapes and darker shades. It's just really pretty to play with. Okay, so I'm going to show you a few petals. Now I'm going to put this disclaimer in. Petals are a little bit harder. And the reason is because we're working with an undefined shape. Okay, so sometimes you second guess yourself. So my encouragement with creativity or a creative process, if you start and you're not sure if it's good or not, just create it and decide later. All right, don't put the pressure on yourself to create perfection. I'm not gonna lie, I was halfway through this and I was like, this is crap. I'm wasting my time. I have a deadline. What am I doing playing with this? And there was just a little part of me that listened to my own advice, which I'm thankful for. And I kept going. I was like, well, I'm halfway in anyways. And I've done it enough times to know that even if some of the things that I do create are crap, the ones that I finish are usually, I either learn something from it and I don't repeat that mistake, or I go, actually, that wasn't so bad. And then I come back the next day and I'm really pleased with it. So that's always nice. Sometimes your mood going into painting can change. All right. So here's the shapes. Yeah, thank you for coming. You've been painting for years and you learned a lot. Yes, that's a win. Thank you so much. Such a compliment. So what I'm doing with my brush, I wanted you to see kind of the shape that I'm going for, and then I'm going to show you kind of how to create it. So it's that same point, pressure point, but instead of going straight down, I'm smearing a bit my brush. And I'm letting the mark be a little bit unpredictable. Okay, here's another just kind of smearing. All right. So the pressure is the most intense at the top of the petal. So I've got, well, it's like a little pressure, intense pressure, a little bit of a curl. All right. Now, one of the lessons in my book is a free flowing floral like this. In my book, like in all my classes, I actually offer pre-drawn art. So that it removes that pressure of having to learn to draw and paint in 2 hours, because flowers, like other things, can be a little intimidating. So like this is a class I've got coming up on the 18th that I'm doing with Christy and Brooke too. It's this one. So she's pre-drawn. I give you the gray lines on the paper. See if I have one that's, oh yeah, here, this is a great example. This is the whale class also coming up. So the lines are pre-drawn for you, and then you trace over them either in a colored pencil or a black line. I love the Sakura markers. They're waterproof ink. And so you can trace over your watercolor, or you can provide the lines before. So what happens is you have a bit more freedom with your painting because the line is defined. So even if you're painting kind of wonky flower petals, the line's already defined, so you don't have to worry quite as much, where the pressure to create petals that look like petals can be a little challenging. All right. So here's a few petals. And then what I'm going to do is when something's very saturated, in order to go from that high to low saturation, I'll just do kind of a clear petal in that same motion. It's almost like a diamond shape. And then I'm just going to touch boundaries. All right. And same with this, I think I'm going to overlap this boundary and just watch it do that beautiful blending. I love that. And you could really fill your whole paper. I did circles the other day as kind of a fun warm-up exercise. This kind of circle, like point, pressure point circles, is really pretty. And then you can do interlocking circles. So point, pressure, point, and it works your point, pressure, point skills. You can start making little shapes. And then it's really fun to just kind of learn how things bleed and move and change as you interact versus, and you learn kind of about boundaries. It's like, okay, what's wet, what's dry, what colors blend together more beautifully than others, which colors like to move and shine where others kind of just we'll stay put. Grab a little moon glow. You guys see that okay? Yeah. Shayna, Alex, yeah, you guys say love combining watercolor with microns. It's so much fun. I was actually going to do that with the wreath, which I can show you guys a little bit how I would do that too, while these petals dry. See what happens when you try to blend something that's already on its way to dry, which if it happens, you can actually, you learn to read your watercolor, and you learn that, okay, this doesn't have any shine. This isn't going to move into it. Okay. I just kind of play. Patricia says, your Modern Watercolor Botanicals book is beautiful. Thank you. My only regret with that book is if I wish I would have picked a less intense title. It's always a mouthful when you have to say it. Christine, thank you so much for this class. Yes, and the watercolor paper resource. And yes, you've learned lots about magic stars. Good, still working on it. Yes, thank you for joining us. Thank you, TDY, thank you very much. Elizabeth, if you have a travel palette with the hard blocks, do you usually clean the palette afterwards or you just leave it? I like to leave it. I can tell you that oftentimes if I'm painting in a class and I need more space, or like in a travel palette, you can get a decent amount of water onto the travel palette lid and then use a paper towel to kind of wipe off a section. So that's what I'll do if I'm, let's say, I'm not too keen on, like I want to blend and I want to make a yellow, I want to have a clean yellow. First of all, I'd probably have to get a new mason jar, but I would also then I'd wet it down and then wipe, and then it's just kind of a clean. So I never really wash it out. I just will clean off sections, because that way you preserve that dab, right, of concentrated color, and you're saving the paint. I very rarely wash away paint, it feels, but I'm a bit of a hoarder. I'm an art supply hoarder totally. Virginia says, thank you. Thank you so much, Virginia. Tracy, thank you. Yes, have a wonderful night. So lovely having you guys. Okay, there's our little flowers. I'll put those aside and I'll play a little bit with a micron. It's fun. So there's lots of great pens, art pens out there where you can add ink on top or before. Micron so far I have found, because they have a waterproof ink, it's a Pigma ink. It just is the best. They have all different sizes. They even have a size 12 and a size 10, which is, if you're familiar with microns, this is a 5. So this was one of the larger ones, and now they have a big one, and it is really fun. I'm trying to see if I grabbed one for our class. I want to be careful I don't mix the wet in with the dry. I won't know what's happening. 2 and 1. No, I didn't grab it. So it's just thick. It's not as thick as a Sharpie, but it's fun because like you can add before, you can add leaves, after you can add leaves. I will say your pen will hold up better if you ink before and paint after. Like what I'm doing right now is a little harder on the pen, but if you press lightly, they really will last a long time. You can do all sorts of fun shapes. This shape that I'm doing, it's my friend Ali has a drawing book, and she says you just do a big C and then a big C and then a line straight down the middle, which is a little leaf. I always love that. But yeah, I also have a flower painting club. So if you want to spend your time watercoloring, but you don't want to have to come up with some botanical masterpiece every time you want to paint, you just want to trace the lines and not worry about having to draw. My flower painting club is really fun. We have a live painting session every month for an hour, and everyone gets to ask their questions and I answer it in paint. And then they also get to vote on what flower they want me to draw for the next month. So I have a vintage strawberry plant to draw for this month, and then it releases on the 1st of every month, which is just really fun. And it's become just a really fun little community. Yay, I'm so glad. Thank you all for coming. So lovely. Good. Practice will be relaxing. That's what I like to hear. It is. It's one of the most relaxing. I feel very blessed to be able to do this for a job and to have people come and want to watch and play and paint. We all need a little bit more relaxing, right? Just draw lines. You can kind of complete the wreath here. I usually like asymmetry. There's all sorts of like studies about whether you do asymmetrical or like even in floral arranging, or if you like symmetrical in decorating. It's so fun, just like color psychology. And then, there's the synesthesism, the idea that when you see a color, you taste a different taste. Or for me, when I see the color yellow, I think of the number 3, and I don't know why, but that's what I think of. And a lot of people feel the same way, which is kind of fun. Oh, there you go. Join the power. Let me type that in for you. It's a blast. Patreon. Let's see if I can spell .com/the mint gardener. There you go. Yeah. And DM me anytime, you guys. The Mint Gardener on Instagram. I think people assume I get lots of messages, but I don't. And even if I got 50 a day, I would be so into answering them, because the painting and artistic community just feels like such a recharge and a refresh. So I think that's what I do to recharge, is just chat with people about paint. And it's just this little happy place. So feel free to message me with any questions about supplies or anything. And Christy and Brooke, like I said, will follow up the class with the all the links, and also like the information where you can email for free paper. So Carol will be so excited. She'll have a whole bunch of emails in her inbox tomorrow. Good, Kathy. I'm glad. A much needed break from life. I feel like I do that. It's like I come down into my little basement studio with all my plants, and I just kind of go into a different world. Art really has this amazing ability, if you can keep it simple and not judge yourself as you're working. I think that, not compare yourself with what you think you're supposed to be doing or where you think you're supposed to be. Or I think keeping it simple and starting small. Creativity is a muscle. It's not something you're necessarily born with. It's something that can be developed. And you don't start throwing 50-pound kettlebells around right when you start. You start with the light stuff, if at all. But that's kind of what I suggest with art is, lift lightly at first, give yourself time to move up. And oftentimes the idea in your head isn't what gets out on paper, but the more you allow yourself to play and express ideas onto paper, the more you build that muscle. And before you know it, I used to just dread painting flowers. I was terrified to paint flowers. And I knew one day someone would say, hey, you should do a loose floral class. And it came, and I spent weeks painting flowers until I got comfortable to just pop out a flower on a page. And it made me sweaty the first couple times, not gonna lie. But now painting flowers is one of my most favorite things to do. And it's, because I practiced with that muscle and eventually grew it strong. And now it's one of our favorite classes at Studio Life. And I think that, when you can learn something front to back, you can then engineer the way to teach it. So I hope that that's been fun for people. I know I have a lot of flowers in my book. Growth mindset versus fixed mindset. Yes, Christine, that's good. I like that. It's that lifelong learner. It's like you kind of you have to find comfort in the unknown. Like I'm taking chess lessons actually, because I feel like it's good for my brain. And I am uncomfortable, and I keep calling the rook a castle. And I keep being told, no, you can't call the rook a castle because castling is an actual move. And then I still can't understand what the significance of the king is, because I don't know why I'm guarding him so heavily when really he's kind of a useless character on the board. And queen is like She is powerful. And so is your knight. Your bishop's semi-powerful, but man, that rook too, the rook. So anyways, it's the lifelong learner. It's being uncomfortable. Sorry, that's shaking so much. I think it's because my hand is shaking when I'm painting or drawing. But yeah, it's being uncomfortable. And, when you stop learning, right? It's not as fun. Have I seen the Queen's Gambit? So I watched one episode and then I don't know what happened. I need to watch that. I got sucked into Victoria, the PBS masterpiece. Oh my gosh, that's so good. And I loved the Queen's Gambit. That might have been why there was like this subliminal messaging that I needed to figure out chess. I was fascinated that she was figuring out chess movements on her ceiling. Fascinating. I just was yeah, just blown away. And I think that the idea of chess kind of intimidated me because it just the endless possibilities feels a little bit like, whoa. But I think that's the game, right? That's the game in there. And so a neighbor referred me to one of his friends, and he's been playing chess for like 15 years. And it's so fun. He gets on his little headset and we play chess online. It's really fun. So, but yeah, I need to watch the Queen's Gambit now, especially since I understand a few of the moves. But yeah. Becky, funny, I assumed that was why you were learning. Yeah, such a great show. Maybe it was. I will just go with it was subliminal messaging. The show was my husband was watching a lot of it, and I really like baths at night, and I am really into Victoria. So I was kind of like torn a little bit between Victoria and my bath and the Queen's Gambit. But now I'm definitely going to go more the Queen's Gambit. Joanne, yeah, Victoria is wonderful too. Good. I love it. Love that too. So good. Joanne, so relaxing. Will likely even sleep better tonight. Oh, I'm so glad. I know. I feel like this is why I'm able to sleep. It's just this chill. I imagine the wet and wet bleeds whenever I have to get my blood pressure taken at the doctor. And they're like, wow, your blood pressure is fantastic. And I'm like, it's because I'm painting in my mind. I just watch the paint move. And I swear it calms me right down. Anna, for some reason I watched all of it except the last episode. I should revisit. See, we're all going to be revisiting. We just need to come up with a show on watercolor so that we can get everybody excited about that too. There's something so fascinating about chess, the fact that it's such an old game and that the rules have pretty much stayed the same for so long. The other thing I really want to challenge myself to learn is Italian. I learned French at UW and had such a wonderful time, but I'm really feeling like I need to pick up Italian. So if anyone has any good tips, I've heard like Rosetta Stone. I don't know where to learn it or how the best way to learn it is. And I figure I should probably just tackle chess for the next few months and then proceed to Italian. But yes, yeah. So excited this was available because I binge watched all of Netflix and Prime Video. Yeah, no kidding, right? It's nice to have something else to do. Anna, yeah, it would be great to see some of what you all have been working on if you're willing to share. We can go to maybe that gallery mode, the Brady Bunch mode, and we can see, this is usually what we do in our studio life class at the end. And on Saturday, it was amazing. There was just this Brady Bunch of squares of all of the whales. And it was just such a happy, that and just being able to see people's teeth and the smiles without the masks is always just such a refreshing way to spend an evening. And I can't believe my children are still quiet, you guys. I told them 7, so this is awesome. All right. Anna,
Wow.
us?
Super pretty. I'll take some screenshots.
Yeah, I do. Oh, there.
We can always we are recording too. We can spice it up so it's just the art if we reuse it.
Grace, thank you. Oh, Shayna, I love you. Did it
Thank
in
you,
the
Sarah.
sketchbook. Oh, thank you. This is so great. Look at how pretty all your guys' work. I just love how expressive paint can be for everyone. The leaf shapes, the colors you guys are naturally drawn to. I wish we were all sitting in a room together and we could Hope you guys are going through the pages and looking. It's pretty awesome. Pretty inspiring to see all of your lovely faces and art reflected back at me. Thank you so much for spending this evening with me. This was truly just what I needed. So nice. All right. Well, Anna, you're going to have to screenshot and share all these with me.
I know. I was thinking I'll go through and I'll take some stills of the recording. That way I always feel like when I try to take screenshots of Zoom, it just never turns out well. So I'm glad we record almost everything. Thank you all for sticking around. It's been really fun. I wish I had painted along, so I'll have to come back and maybe watch on my own sometime. And again, we'll share the recording with you. We'll share that link for the paper. We'll also make sure you get some links to Sarah's website, her social media as well, if you want to explore that more. I'll put some details on that discount as well. That goes through the end of March. So that way you just have everything packaged in one place. If you're following along with the first 90 and you're in our creative group, all these materials are going to go up on that page on our webpage. So you can access that ongoing. We're kind of figuring out how we're going to repurpose all of our courses and whatnot that we've been doing the last 90 days. So no worries if you've been busy, or, if you know someone who would love this, they'll get the content. Sarah, thank you so much. It's been really fun just listening to you. I feel like my heart rate is super down. A good way to go into the evening. And Brooke, Christy, it's been really great partnering with you. So thank you. I hope you're seeing all the kudos in the chat.
We are. It's just life-giving. Thank you guys. All your smiles just making me so happy. Real teeth, real mouths.
Yeah.
So exciting.